In California, we've been investing significantly on public transit, especially trains, in the last few decades. My guest today is Marc Joffe, who's a fellow at California Policy Center. He's been studying different projects, especially with trains across the state, from Southern California to Northern California. He's here to tell us which projects are doing well and were accomplished on budget and on time, and which projects are in trouble and how much they cost.
Here you have a relatively low utilization system, probably about 7,500 people, costing close to $600 million, which really should have been handled through a bus. I think we've generally accepted as a society, and I accept, that transit is going to be subsidized. But I think it should be subsidized within reason.
We also discussed the bullet train that's going from Los Angeles to San Francisco. Recently, President Trump announced that he's going to investigate this project. In this episode, we'll discuss a little bit about how this project is going and what are the costs. I'm Siamak Khorrami. Welcome to California Insider. Marc, it's great to have you back on. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me again, Siamak.
We want to talk to you about public transportation in California and specifically on the trains. You've done a lot of research and studies on this, and there's a lot of money that has been invested into trains. Can you tell us what's happening? You can go throughout the state and tell us from the Bay Area.
So there's a number of projects in the Bay Area that are in some level of being started or completed or being conceptualized. And as time goes on, they become more and more expensive and they take more and more time. And at the same time, we have fewer people riding transit because of the pandemic. So the cost-benefit ratio of these projects is really getting out of hand. One project that a lot of people are following is an extension of the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, which is our main subway system in the
BART,
in Bay Area, BART, from Berryessa, which is in the northern part of San Jose, through downtown San Jose, and over to Santa Clara near Levi Stadium. So that is a 6-mile extension, and originally, we thought it was going to cost maybe $4 or $5 billion, but it's gone through various cost revisions and now is up to $12.75 billion, which is over $2 billion a mile. At the same time, it doesn't look like that many people will ride it. The official ridership estimate is 32,900 per day, but that is something that's been done by the project sponsor, which is the Valley Transportation Authority. They're usually biased upwards. The last time they did an estimate, which was for the first part of this San Jose extension, they overestimated by something like 8 to 10 times. So it's very possible that only a small fraction of 32,900 people will use this, and it's going to cost $12.75 billion and not be finished until 2039. So it really raises questions about whether these projects make sense anymore in terms of the cost versus the benefits.
And what else is out there?
So another project that I've been focusing on is called the Portal. So what this would do is it would extend service from Caltrain Station in San Francisco, which is on the outskirts of San Francisco's downtown, to Salesforce Transit Center, 1.3 miles away. And the current estimate for that project is $8.25 billion. So if you take $8.25 billion and you divide by 1.3, you get something like $6 billion per mile, which would make it the most expensive transit project ever in terms of cost per mile. So again, looking at the ridership, they've forecast over 40,000 riders on that extension. However, that's based on high-speed rail being completed, because high-speed rail would be sharing tracks with Caltrain, and then the high-speed rail trains, along with the commuter trains from San Jose up to San Francisco, would finally go to the Salesforce Transit Center. The problem with that is high-speed rail may never reach the Caltrain tracks because of the cost overruns on that project. And if it doesn't, you'd really only see a few thousand riders per day, using track that's going to cost $8.25 billion.
How does the ridership calculate it?
So the agency that's proposing the project to the federal government, and that's normally where we get these ridership studies from, looking at reports from the Federal Transit Administration, which is part of the Department of Transportation in the federal government. They're required to do a ridership model and then report that as part of their grant package. So that's normally the source of ridership information. But again, normally, or I would say frequently, those ridership estimates have proven to be very, very extremely overestimated.
And BART is facing some challenges too, right?
Yeah.
In terms of ridership right now, right?
Yes. So BART, relative to other systems, had very good fare box recovery. Fare box recovery is a concept in transit where you take the quotient of the fare revenue and the operating costs, right? So how much are riders contributing to the cost of running BART or another system? So before the pandemic, they were, I think, over 50%. Now they're way down, maybe in the 20s to 30s. And they are still, again, relatively good compared to most transit systems in the Bay Area and statewide, because their fares are relatively high and they do have relatively high ridership compared to other systems. But because BART now has less ridership overall, it makes a lot less sense to try to extend it because there aren't that many people using it in the first place.
And there's been attempts to actually do this kind of transportation for Southern California, right?
Yes. But before I turn to Southern California, there's one other project in Northern California, if I might cover. So we talked about the portal, which would go into Salesforce Transit Center. Then BART is working on a project that would extend service beyond Salesforce Transit Center over to Oakland, providing us with a second cross-bay system. And this project is called Link 21.
So this is going underneath?
This would be going underneath. So we already have a BART tunnel between Oakland and San Francisco. The idea is to create a second tunnel. Now that made sense back in 2016 when this was first proposed, because a lot of people were riding BART. At that time, the daily ridership on BART was over 400,000. Now it's less than 200,000. So we're no longer probing the capacity limits of BART, and yet this project keeps going on and on and on. There's been over $120 million spent on consulting to analyze and conceptualize the system. They've also run an equity group that's looking at what the fairness issues are around this project. But we don't know what the total cost of it would ultimately be. The first estimate that was done was several years ago, came out to $28.8 billion, again, for really a redundant system. Transit experts that I've spoken to in the Bay Area think that with all the inflation that happened, in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, and just generally, we think that the cost would be at least $45 billion. So
wow.
This dwarfs, because we talked about a $12 billion, we talked about $8 billion. Here we have a system that might potentially cost $45 billion and doesn't seem to have a really strong justification in terms of ridership. So turning to Southern California.
But over there in Northern California, people use the public transit more than Southern California, right?
I mean, the ridership of LA Metro, I think overall is quite high relative to other systems. I think it's definitely in the top 5 or 10 systems. And LA Metro has generally had better cost discipline than the Bay Area transit systems. Their cost overruns and time overruns have not been as bad. So I think I would be a little bit less concerned about what's happening in LA. They do have a project in front of the Federal Transit Administration right now called the Southeast Gateway, which is, I think, an 8.7 mile extension approximately. But the cost is only about $600 million per mile. And as we talked about before, we saw projects $2 billion to $6 billion per mile in the Bay Area. So while I think that's less bad, again, I think that the ridership would ultimately not justify doing it as a rail system, and they should really look at an alternative called bus rapid transit, which I could explain.
Now, why do the Bay Area projects cost that much? Why do they cost 10 times? Like, in a sense, what's the reason?
I don't really have a good handle on why, because it's still California. We really have basically the same rules statewide, right, in terms of project labor agreements, heavy use of union labor. Those would be major drivers. the same kind of reliance on third-party contractors that don't necessarily have the right incentives. So, for example, a third party, might build a subway system like they did in San Francisco, and then there are construction defects. For example, in the central subway of San Francisco, there have been leaks, and the vendor, does not really get dinged for that. In fact, they just, are brought back in to do fixes. So the incentives that vendors have often are to make the project take longer and cost more rather than get the project done quickly because they're on the hook for any cost overruns. So those are really California-wide. I think it's just seems like it's just better management, in San Diego as well as Los Angeles than we have in the Bay Area.
Is there much more going on in San Diego and Orange County and LA?
Well, so San Diego, as far as I can tell, doesn't have a lot of active projects right now. The last project was completed in 2021, close to budget and close to schedule. So I think San Diego is not really a problem center right now in terms of high cost overrun systems. But unfortunately, we do have a situation not far from the studio in Orange County. So the Orange County Transportation Authority several years ago proposed a project in Santa Ana called the OC Streetcar. So this is a 4.15 mile streetcar line that runs from the Santa Ana Metrolink station over to Garden Grove. And originally it was supposed to cost $289 million, but and be finished in 2021. So now we're looking at an estimate of $579 million, which is double, and a completion date of August 2025. But I don't think they're even going to make that, because to reach August 2025, you'd already really need to be in testing right now, and they're not in testing. Usually there are several months of testing for a brand new system. So I think you're going to be seeing a further delay and probably a further cost overrun as well. And so here you have a relatively low utilization system, probably about 7,500 people, costing close to $600 million, which really should have been handled through a bus. And buses have, I think, a bad reputation because they're seen as slow, inefficient, poor people's transit, unfortunately, which I think is often a generalization, which I think is really unfair. But buses can be structured in a variety of ways. So there's a concept called bus rapid transit, where the bus has a lot of the same attributes as a streetcar. It can run through red lights because the light changes when the bus is coming. It can have what's called level boarding. You don't have to walk upstairs and walk downstairs to get on and off the vehicle. It can run faster as a result with less stopping time. And that could have been done for a lot less than the cost of a streetcar, because a streetcar requires a lot of bespoke elements, track, special vehicles, vehicle maintenance facilities, all these kinds of specialized things that aren't required when you use much more generic technology like a bus.
Our sponsor today is Shenyun. There's been some negative press on Shenyun recently. Shenyun's mission is to revive ancient and traditional Chinese culture. Shenyun Performance started by a group of Falun Gong practitioners in New York. Falun Gong is a spiritual and religious group which believes in living by truth, compassion, and tolerance, putting others first. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, has been persecuting it since July of 1999 in China. Since Shenyun started, CCP has been targeting it in the US and across the globe by playing different kinds of schemes to cancel the shows or impact the performance. The current negative reporting originated from some Chinese social media accounts. And we know that CCP is given a new directive to go after Shenyun and Falun Gong in the US by turning the public opinion against them. If you hear something negative on Shenyun, make sure to do your own research and your own due diligence. Despite all of CCP's campaigns against Shenyun, the show has managed to grow significantly across the world. I highly recommend you go see it. I've been going to it for the last 14 years as they change the performances every year. They're coming back to California. Make sure you go see it. You seem to be concerned about the Bay Area, the funds that are spent on these projects. Why?
Well, I think taxpayers should really be getting value for money. I think that transit is an essential feature of urban living. It's not really feasible anymore for transit to be totally self-financing. So, we're not in the late 19th century or early 20th century when all transit systems were private, they will run for profit. That doesn't work any longer because the cost of operating a transit system are so high. So I think we've generally accepted as a society, and I accept, that transit is going to be subsidized. But I think it should be subsidized within reason. And when you get a situation where a system might have less than 10% fare box recovery, meaning only riders pay less than $1 out of 10 of the operating costs, and then you have capital costs going into the billions of dollars per mile, it really needs to be reeled back in, because I think it ultimately discredits the idea of transit being an important part of urban life. Because if it's so expensive, ultimately it's going to lose support.
Going back to the projects that are in the state, you brought up the bullet train, and there's another one that we're building to Vegas. Can you tell us about the bullet train project?
Sure. In 2008, voters approved Proposition 1A, which provided authority to borrow $9.9 billion of bond money. And the idea was that was going to be then matched by federal funds and private participation to build a line between Anaheim, Los Angeles, and San Francisco that would cost around $33 billion. Unfortunately, the costs have turned out to be a lot higher, and also the time for building the project has taken a lot longer than expected. So originally, we were told that maybe this would be done in 2020. Now we're looking at potentially 171 miles from Merced to Bakersfield being completed in the early 2030s. So the cost escalation and the time escalation has been very concerning. I will say that while the project, I think, was very disorganized in the 2010s, it seems to have stabilized now. I think there's stronger management and a better culture at high-speed rail. So it looks like they aren't continually pushing back deadlines, and they're making certain milestones. But still, it's not providing the value that we originally had hoped. And I believe you will see, ultimately, when the 171 miles needs to be finished, further stress. Another problem that they have is the high-end estimate for getting to the completion of this phase one, which is the Merced to Bakersfield plus other fixed costs that they've had, is $35 billion. And they only have about $27 or $28 billion secured. So they're going to have to do something in terms of either getting cost reductions or finding additional funds at the state or federal level, or potentially involving a private entity to fill that gap. With the election of Donald Trump, it seems very unlikely that they'll get more federal funds. The state is a little bit tighter now than it was a few years ago, right? We had a big deficit in 2023. We've closed that now. So we're sort of like looking at a balanced budget, but there's not a lot of money available to just make new investments like this. So I think they're really going to struggle, but there's a lot of public will and a lot of support behind this. So they may very well finish something. I just don't think it's what we were originally led to expect.
So you're saying it would be $35 billion to do the Merced to Bakersfield?
Plus that, and that includes the cost of operating the high-speed rail authority, and also doing all the environmental studies for the rest of the ultimate route, which includes San Francisco, San Jose, through the Pacheco Pass, and then south of Bakersfield through the Tehachapi's down to Los Angeles and ultimately to Anaheim. All that's been studied. That costs a lot of money to do those studies, and that's in the $35 billion.
Now, when do you think the other parts will be completed, or any thoughts on how much it will cost?
So the high-end estimate for that right now is $128 billion. So that's $93 billion beyond the 35 that we've already discussed. We know that they don't even have the full 35, so coming up with that additional $93 billion is going to be incredibly challenging. And again, I think that doesn't happen unless there's a change back in the federal administration and or the state finds a lot of money that currently doesn't have. So I don't really think there's any, reasonable estimate for when that part of the system would be put online.
And do you think that one is worth it if it costs that much? Have you done any research or study on the economic value of the train?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, ridership estimates tend to be overstated. So at one time, the High-Speed Rail Authority was projecting that if they were able to get this Anaheim, Los Angeles, San Francisco segment done, that they would be over 40 million riders per year. They've taken that down a little. I think it's something like 28 million right now, and I apologize if I don't have that number exactly right, but it's in that ballpark. They took that down because population growth isn't what was expected. So when high-speed rail was originally conceptualized, we were thinking that by 2050, maybe we'd have 54 million people in California. Now it looks more like 41 or 42 million people. So there's less people to potentially ride this. I think also, the propensity to ride has been permanently reduced by the growth in work from home, remote meetings and so forth. So that's another factor, and I don't really think that's been factored in. I think, any estimate of 28 or 30 million or whatever is very optimistic because we have the benchmark of the Northeast Corridor service, which links Washington, New York, and Boston, which has a similar population in the catchment zone, but only about 13 million riders annually. To me, that's probably the best that high-speed rail can hope for because you're looking at a similar population that has had 100+ years of experience with riding the train. Here, we're going to have to convince people who are right now driving or taking the plane to ride the train. So at best, I think they will be at 13 million. And if there are 13 million and we had to pay 13 million annual riders and we had to pay $128 billion to get the system, it doesn't look really good from a cost-benefit point of view.
Is the high-speed rail faster?
It would be faster than driving. Driving is 5 or 6 hours, depending on traffic in LA and in the East Bay as you approach San Francisco. There can be huge traffic jams there, so you can have a lot of variability around how long it would take. High-speed rail is theoretically supposed to go from Los Angeles to San Francisco in 2 hours and 40 minutes. That's in the ballot language. That's really impossible to achieve because they'll be sharing tracks at the northern and southern ends of the system and will not be able to reach the 220 miles per hour that they originally planned. So I think you'd be really looking at maybe 3 to 4 hours, but that's still less than driving. It's not less than flying. Now, you can make the argument, and I think this is a legitimate argument. You got to go to the airport. You got to go through security. Then at the other end, you got to get to wherever you need to get. But at the same time, very few people are going to be wanting to go from Caltrain station in San Francisco to Union Station in LA or Arctic Station in Anaheim, right? So there's ultimately another thing, another last mile challenge that you'll have with high-speed rail as well. But you don't have to go through security, and that's a good thing. When I go back east, I never take the plane from New York to Washington or back. I always take Amtrak. And I don't even have to take Acela. I'll take the Northeast Regional, which probably goes no more than 80 or 100 miles an hour. And I still find that, overall, I don't have to deal with going to the airport. I go downtown to downtown, more leg room, easier, more comfortable. I can get up and go to the bar, for a meal. So I think it definitely has its advantages. I don't want to, totally dismiss rail. I think it has a lot of potential advantages. Just I don't think they can get more than 13 million people a year.
Now, there's another one that is going to connect LA to Vegas. Can you talk about that one? That one is high speed too, right?
Yes. So there's a private railroad in Florida that's been pretty successful. They've been linking Miami to Fort Lauderdale, and now they're all the way up to Orlando. And what they've been doing is not full high-speed rail, but higher speed rail. I think the maximum speed is about 125 miles per hour. But they've gotten some pretty good ridership numbers on that line, and they provide a very elevated experience. The trains are very nice. And the stations are very nice. You stay in a very luxurious lounge that, similar to an airport lounge that you might get if you're a frequent flyer. So that's worked out pretty well. And so they've come out to California. They actually bought another agency that was trying to do this. And they are now have all the approvals and much of the funding to build a railroad connecting Rancho Cucamonga in the LA suburbs with Las Vegas, and quite a central location in Las Vegas. So this project is supposed to cost $12 billion. It's a little shorter than LA to San Francisco in high-speed rail, but the main reason why it's so much cheaper is that they're going to run mostly in the median of I-15. And that provides a lot of savings. With California High-Speed Rail, what they did is they created a whole brand new right-of-way for a couple of reasons. First of all, they wanted to serve downtown Fresno and Bakersfield. So if they'd ran through I-5, which I think would have been the better choice for them, they wouldn't have had stations in Fresno and Bakersfield that would have been on the trunk line. They would have had to build connector lines. Second, to get to that 220 miles per hour, you need to be very straight. You can't have a lot of curves. So they had to create a new right-of-way by buying up farmland, buying land in cities, often destroying businesses, to get this really straight line. Brightline's not doing that. They're going to go through I-15 and make the compromise that for much of the way they won't be achieving this maximum speed, which I think in their case is about 200 miles per hour. So it'll be somewhat high speed. It'll be the first train that does achieve 200 miles per hour at any point, because right now the best we have, I think, is Amtrak in northern Maryland at 160 miles an hour. So they'll definitely set a record there. And if they provide this high quality service, they may attract fairly good ridership. They also have a very aggressive schedule. Right now they're projecting that they'll establish revenue service in December of 2028, just 4 years from now. If they did that and they only spent $12 billion and they got good ridership, that would be a very nice result.
Now, from what you're saying, it might make sense for the high-speed rail from LA to San Francisco. If they were in the middle of the 5 freeway, people could drive to them from Fresno and Bakersfield, right?
Yeah, or they could run a connector from a downtown location in Fresno and a downtown location in Bakersfield to I-5. But the thing is, we're sort of dug in at this point. We've spent so much time and money building this. There's like you get into economics, this concept of sunk cost. You're not really supposed to consider. Okay, we spent $13 billion so far to get to what we have, right? If it would actually be cheaper to build along I-5 than to continue to do what we're doing, you could argue, yeah, you should do it. Then there'll be the question of what do you do with all the structures and all the ditches and so forth that have been dug already for the existing trains. So from a pure economic point of view, I could see a case for abandoning what has been done and moving to I-5. But I think politically and psychologically, I think it would be very, very hard to get there.
You mentioned politically and psychologically, but there has been some complaints from the same communities that have the high speed going through there. I've heard some politicians from Fresno and certain areas that are complaining that this line is coming and is dividing people's lands and it hasn't really been built. What are your thoughts on that?
They've already taken the hit. I mean, the land has been acquired in Fresno at least. Bakersfield, no, so that's true. Bakersfield has yet to experience this. But in Fresno, they've acquired all the land that they need to acquire, and they're building everything that they need to build. So at this point, to abandon it, I would think people in Fresno would generally be very disappointed if they just stopped at this point. They've also built support in the Central Valley by creating a lot of high-paying union jobs. So there are individuals and families in the Central Valley that like high-speed rail because it's giving them opportunities to do work that is rewarding. I mean, they're seeing structures going up, and that pays quite well.
They could be doing that along the side of the 5 freeway. It's close anyway. So.
They could, yes. But Yeah, again, so I'll go back to the point that the damage in Fresno has already been done. So at this point, if you've already condemned the businesses that you were going to condemn, or acquired the businesses that you were going to acquire, and already started building structures, there's some expectation that you're going to finish at this point. And I can understand. I don't necessarily think that this should be the decider, but I can understand why people in Fresno would be, at this point, mostly disappointed if this stopped.
Now, you've done a lot of research you've been studying the trains in California, and the public transit system here, public transportation system here, in a sense, is pretty weak, right? People usually use their own cars.
Right.
And is there a way to improve the public transportation system here in California?
Right. So compared to California, cities back east developed before cars became popular. And as a result, they developed densely and around transit. So the New York City subway system goes all the way back to 1904. And even before 1904, going back into the 1800s, there were already elevated train lines. So people like me who grew up in New York City grew up with the idea that you're mostly going to use the subway or the elevated train to get to where you need to get to. In California, it's much more suburbanized, much more spread out in most areas, with maybe the possible exception of downtown San Francisco, which has a lot less pedestrian traffic than it did before the pandemic. So it's just harder for transit to penetrate because of the heavy use of cars. Since the last 5 years, transit has also gotten a bad reputation for being dirty, having a lot of crime, having homeless people on it. And so a lot of people who might be choice riders, people who could potentially take the train or use their car, are becoming increasingly less likely to use transit.
And they might be using Uber and other.
Yes. And again, if they can afford it.
Now, Marc, you seem to care about the public money, the money going to these public projects. When was the time you started getting passionate about that?
I've been a fiscal conservative for a very long time. When I was in high school during the 70s, and we started to have significant budget deficits, and I'm, oh my God, we have a $1 billion budget deficit. What are we going to do at the federal level? And of course, now we have $1 trillion budget deficits. So I've always been concerned. I'm a late stage baby boomer. I'd like to leave the stage for future generations with better fiscal balance. I think our generation has really run up the credit card, and I think that's very unfair to the generations that are following us. So I really think we need to look at sort of tightening things that can be tightened. And so where we're wasting money, not using it efficiently, we really need to look at that more carefully.
And so you've been on the sideline watching all of this. Is it challenging to watch and see the money going, but people are spending it?
Well, it's really tough in the Bay Area. So I've been writing about issues around rail and transit for several years now. Sometimes I'll get a piece into the local newspaper, or I might be speaking at a public meeting, and I find that people are just generally very dismissive, because the people who are really interested in transit don't tend to think in economic terms. So, why are you, being the spoiler at our party? We just believe that we need more and more transit, and it's good. It's good for climate change. It's good for mobility. Why do we need anybody critical of this? And ultimately, I just think that's the wrong view. So I think that ultimately more people will adopt my position. In 2024, in the Bay Area, there was an attempt at an affordable housing bond measure. Affordable housing and transit tend to go together. And that had to be withdrawn from the ballot because people like me were critical of the cost of it. And now in 2026, they plan to go for a ballot measure to increase sales taxes to pay for transit, because transit is losing so much money. And I think they are worried now because my side of it, the people who are more fiscally conservative seem to be gaining a little bit of momentum, and so it's more difficult to pass additional taxes.
Now, the people that are proposing these mass transit ideas with the trains, do they think that if they build it, the ridership will come and eventually people's behaviors will change?
I think that's if we build it, they'll come. I think that is a mentality that's there. I just think that just misses a lot. You can't really look at how things were 50 or 75 years ago because we have Uber and Lyft. We are getting self-driving cars. In San Francisco, for example, where there's a lot of support for public transit, we also have Waymo, which are driverless vehicles that you can call on an app and go anywhere, and that's spreading to Los Angeles and Phoenix as well. So the world is changing, and transit continues to be a very high-cost way that's really built to move large numbers of people simultaneously. It's not great for people having very individualized plans with going to specific locations at various times. And I don't think the pro-transit side really understands that the world has changed and transit is just not going to be like it was 50 or 75 years ago.
Now, going back to, you mentioned in the 70s you saw the $1 billion deficit. Yeah. How did you learn about that? What was it like for you?
So in high school, I got interested in what was called the gold bugs. So there were people who were forecasting that because the government was spending a lot of money that it didn't have and then printing it, that there was going to be a runaway inflation and we would all be living in log cabins and there would be urban riots and so forth. So, as a young, impressionable kid, I got really interested in that. I bought gold and so forth. And as an adult, I came to realize that our society is a lot stronger than the pessimists believe. And yes, we have a lot of deficits. We continue to have a lot of deficits. We will survive in some form. It's just that I don't think it's fair now to younger people for us to continue overspending in the way that we're doing.
Marc Joffe, fellow at California Policy Center. It was great to have you, California Insider.
Thanks for having me, CMAC.